as many of you have seen before, and you've heard kind of throughout the day, BookNet does a lot of data gathering about the Canadian, primarily English language book market. And so it's my obligation, my reward to kind of give you some of this overview of the data we collected over the last year or so. So, as I said, I'm going to primarily talk about the Canadian English language trade market here. And I'm going to start with physical print book sales, and then I'm going to move through some of the other data we have on some of the other formats and some of the other areas. I do have some French language data, so I'm going to present that too. So last year, our sales data panel tracked just over $1 billion of retail spend from the retailers we capture data from. So that's physical book sales in the trade market in Canada, English language. And that's about 80 to 85% of the retail market in Canada. So if you model that up, we figure that the trade physical book sales in Canada are about $1.3 billion, okay, on trade. Physical. Last year, we charted sales of almost 700,000 ISBNs, 697,000, and once again, that's up from the previous year. So we've seen this trend, and I've commented on it here before. We see more and more ISBNs charting sales every year, but less and less sales. So the market's being divvied up amongst more and more content all the time. When you look at that in dollars over the last 3 years, this is what the market looks like. It's down about 2% year over year in dollars, and this is not from our full retail panel. This is from our comparable stores panel, and I'll talk about that in a second. This is unit sales for the last 7 years now in our comparable stores panel, so it's been going down. And some of that is, this is physical book sales, right? So some of this will be taken up by ebooks, in fact, a lot of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that a little further along. As I said, we have a function in sales data where we have some store models that we track without adding new retailers, because we're always adding new retailers to the panel. Monique presented earlier that we added close to 20 new retailers to the panel last year. And so when you just go with adding new retailers to the panel, this is what it looks like in unit sales. It's pretty flat across the market over the last kind of 7 years. This is similar to what we're seeing in other English language markets for trade book sales, although in the US it's been trending up a little bit more in physical book sales over the last few years. And so these, that last bar there, 2017, is 687 million units. So, but they've been trending up a little bit for the last few years, so it's a little bit different than what we're seeing. So adult nonfiction title unit sales increased 3% year over year in 2017, with continued acceleration in the self-help, political science, business, and cooking categories. Fiction was down 1% in the US, and children's books continued to thrive with a 3% boost in 2017. Similar kind of behavior as we're seeing here. When we look at the Canadian market broken down by subject, it looks like this. I've shown a slide like this before. Juvenile is 40% of the book sales. And so juvenile in the BISAC subject category world includes 4% of YA. YA is a relatively new BISAC subject category, so it's not charting as high as it probably is. So it's contained in that 40%. We're becoming a juvenile market, at least in the physical book sales. When we look at that over year, the kind of greenish line trending up is juvenile. All the other lines are kind of trending down, and young adults, just there for reference, it's at the bottom. I said it's a relatively new. This is a percentage, so if something goes up, something else must come down. So year over year, nonfiction in Canada actually took the biggest hit. We were down 6% in units. That was different than the US, which was up 3%. So juvenile was down about 2%, and fiction was down about 2%. With subjects and the macro, there's, when you look at the big, it can go up and go down, but when you look at the small subject categories, they can change all the time. So we did see, these are our largest increases in subject categories in Canada year over year. So science, poetry, and historical fiction were all up considerably. So there were other categories that went up quite well too. So within fiction, there was crime, fantasy, and mystery. And in nonfiction, there was self-help, body, mind, spirit, and true crime. Those are BISAC subject categories. There's this huge boost in crime and true crime that we're hearing all over the place. So I don't even think that's Trump books. So 20, 154, and 48, does anyone know what books are causing those lifts in those subject categories? It's usually just one book. It's not a bingo question. So here they are. So in science, Neil deGrasse Tyson was a huge title last year. In poetry, for the last 2 years running, Rupi's been a huge, huge hit and lifted that category up. But it isn't just her books. Even if you took Rupi out of poetry, poetry still did very, very well. And then in historical, there's a lot of historical fiction. There's a lot of historical fiction, but the Alice Network was a huge title last year. Also, there was the Follett book, the Ken Follett book in historical fiction, and science also contained The Inner Life of Animals, which was a pretty big title last year. So in the poetry category, the Rupi phenomenon has gone on to other authors as well in poetry. And so a lot of this is tied to Instagram and Tumblr, and that seems to be a new phenomenon. So there's R.H. Sin and Amanda Lovelace, all contributing to that poetry area. And I know there's a lot of consternation about those poets and how they write poetry and things like that, but that's where the readers are going, and that's where the buyers are going. So it's something we're going to watch. And I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. Another interesting thing we saw last year is that backlist grew significantly as a portion of sales. It moved to 60% of all sales was generated by backlist last year, which was a 4% increase over the previous year. Now, there's some factors that contributed to that. It's partly because of two strong female authors, Rupi and Margaret Atwood. Margaret Atwood always has a good year, but had a great year last year because of TV and movies. But some of Rupi's poetry books are a little older too, so that really pulled the backlist titles up quite a bit. So that's something we monitor quite frequently, is what media is doing to the consumption of titles. Obviously, the Margaret Atwood titles are huge. So I'll talk really briefly about the Canadian-French market. This is, again, trade, book sales, and the physical. And this data came from BayTLF. So BookNet's counterpart in the Quebec market is BayTLF, and they collect French language sales in Quebec primarily, but also across Canada when they can. So I asked them for some data, and they were generous enough to pass it along. So they charted the French market the Quebecois market, or the French language market, at 277 million in trade anyway, and 16.5 million units. Their panel represents about 55% of the market in Quebec for French language. And year over year, the numbers were up 4.4% from comp stores. There's more of that data. You can reach out to BayTLF or go on their site and then ask for it, or subscribe to their services. So you can get lots more data on the print book market in our annual, the Canadian Book Market 2017, or if you're a sales data subscriber, you can grab it from there. So that's all I'm going to do on the kind of top line numbers. There's lots more stuff in this annual and on our blog as well. So basically, I want to switch a little bit of gears here to some of our reader surveys. So some of you heard me talk yesterday about the focus on the reader and how important it is. BookNet spends a lot of time reaching out to readers when we can, just like our bookstore panels does, and you all do, to find out what they want to consume and how they want to consume it and where they want to consume it. So we do 2 primary surveys and then a lot of ad hoc surveying as well. So the one that we do, and I'll touch on here and I touch on every year, is our reader survey. So we go out once a year to ask Canadians about how they're reading and how much they're reading and things like that. And then we do a long-term consumer panel, which I'm also going to touch on as well. Our goal with these surveys, I think I've already put this forward, is to understand the Canadian publishing, retail, library landscape in as much detail as we can. We also want to understand how technology impacts businesses and ultimately how, why, when, and where it impacts what Canadians buy and read. Online sales and global marketplace create unexpected trends that can seemingly pop out of the blue. Erratic demand is more and more the norm in our business. So this is our reading and leisure data. This wasn't a question we asked if you read with sharks or not, but it's interesting. So this is the percentage of Canadians who told us they read a book last year. It has been trending down for the last 3 or 4 years, and I've presented this data here before, and I've said I'm not worried about the trend because it's within the margin of error. I might be getting worried about the trend. It's starting to get outside the margin of error, and it's continuing. That's a trend line that's showing some behavior. So it's something we want to watch, and I know there's a lot of initiatives at foot to keep reading high, and this is book reading. There's lots of reading happening, but book reading actually is what I'm talking about here. When we break that down demographically, maybe this is the good news. The blue bands are this year, and the pink bands are last year. The top bands, the very top grouping, is the youngest readers. So they actually read more last year than they did the year before, and that's what they told us. More of them read last year than they did the before. And it's actually the top 2 bands said that, and it's the middle bands that say they read a little less last year and they're pulling it down. So maybe that's good news. Our youngins are reading. So we can compare that again against the US data a little bit. So this is the Pew Research Center's data charted against our data. So this is for the last 5 years. 2017, the Pew Research Center didn't do a study, so I don't have data for that year. And before we all pat ourselves on the back that Canadians read more than US folks, that's probably not the case. The methodology for the Pew study is a little bit different. Where ours is an online study, theirs is a phone study. So they're calling people, so they're more likely to hit people who are not readers. But in online surveys, you have to be able to read. You have to be pretty literate to answer an online survey. So I think there's some of that going on. But what I'm trying to represent here is it's fairly consistent across both markets. And if you look at UK data, it's also fairly similar. So what did people read in Canada? This is the percentage of people who told us they read the different formats. So the top blue line is the percentage of people who read. The yellow line is print books, or orange line is print books, I guess. The red line is ebooks, and the green line is audiobooks. So this is the percentage of Canadians who told us they read that format each year, not the number of books. So you can see pretty steady lines. There's a lot more people reading digitally and listening to audiobooks digitally than are buying, right? So it's an interesting thing. Similarly, with the US, they're very, very similar lines, but about 10 points lower. So it's just, that's the way the data is, and I think it has a lot to do with the methodology. We also ask our readers to our reader survey where they got their books. So it's not the percentage of books. Again, this is the percentage of people who told us they acquire their books at these different outlets. So 43% of people acquired ebooks from an online reader. That makes sense. Most people acquired the print books that they read either at a physical bookstore or the library. Ebooks were acquired in an online retailer, the library, or a free site. That makes sense. Audiobooks were acquired via subscription and a library. So that makes sense as well. So I want to call out a few of these. Free books. So let's talk about free books for a second. And when I'm talking about free books, I'm not talking about library books. So what am I talking about? Well, it's hard to say exactly what I'm talking about, but a huge portion of the books that are places that people are acquiring books, they label as free sites. And so I've lumped some of them together here because I'm not sure that panelists are always honest when they're doing things illegal, right? So, but some of these are truly free sites. So there's Project Gutenberg, LibriVox, there's a bunch of sites in this data, and we ask them which sites they are, where they actually are acquiring either public domain books or books that people have just put out there for free. But there's a large portion in here that seems to be torrent sites as well. And so, I'm not a huge fan or expert on piracy, so I didn't want to spend a lot of time talking about it, but I wanted to call out one study that you may or may not have heard of, and it's a free study, so you can go pick it up after the conference if you want. So this study was done by Nielsen and Digimarc in the US, and it was done out of their consumer data, and they run a similar consumer panel that we do, and it looked at 514 book buyers in the US who said that they downloaded a book illegally. So you can see that this is the reasons why they say they download illegally. That bottom band, the 17% who say, I don't think I should have to pay for content, well, they're a lost cause, right? Probably don't need to spend a lot of effort on them. They're just going to go out and download stuff. But these other people who say that they are going down to pirate books or get books from illegal download sites just because it's inconvenient, it's just because it's convenient or easy, maybe that's something we can work on. Also, what's interesting to note in this study is that a lot of these people who download illegally ebooks actually buy really a lot of ebooks too, 13 to 17 a year. And they download 3 to 7 a year. So they're almost double or more than double of the books that they acquire in the year, ebooks anyway, that they acquire in the year, are ones that they actually purchased. So here's the study. It's interesting. It's not a massive sample set, but it's there. And my slides will be available after, so you don't have to make notes here. The other thing it noted was that illegal downloaders are 18 to 34, educated, and wealthy. So take that. I want to talk just briefly about library acquisition. We had library people here yesterday at eBookCraft, and we had people today presenting about libraries and the digital divide. So it's a very interesting thing, and they're stakeholders of BookNet, so we spend some time with them. So a lot of book acquisition, people say they get from the library, which makes sense. So this is the Toronto Public Library. There's a lot of beautiful libraries in Canada right now, lots of new ones opening up. So I reached out to TPL, and they were happy to provide me some data. The great thing about libraries is they're always really happy to provide data when they can, so we really like that. So they told me that ebook lending, if you were here yesterday, you may have saw this, they lent out 3.7 million items of ebook items last year in Toronto. That was up almost 13% year over year. Audio, they lent out almost 1 million items, and it was up 38%. Print, they lent out 25 million items in Toronto, and that was down 9%, but with an asterisk because their North York main library branch was closed for much of last year, so they think that that had an impact on that. But it's interesting because the audio's up everywhere. Ebook, we've heard similar things from other public libraries across Canada, and it's maybe contrary to what we're hearing in the media about ebook consumption being down and things like that. It seems to be going up, actually, and some of our data backs that up, too. So I've tried to stick Canadian images wherever I can in here, but I had really a tough time finding a Canadian celebrity buying a book. Anywhere, maybe my Google foo is bad, I'm not sure, but I figured, the Obamas seem to be spending really a lot of time in Canada right now, so we can adopt Barack, right? We'll take him. He's a good guy. So with that aside, let's move on to some purchasing data. So this is up to the end of 2017. So this is what, in our consumer panel, what our consumers tell us they're purchasing. So paperbacks, hardcovers, ebooks, and audio. The audio is probably a little low for us because people don't always equate streaming subscription content with actually purchasing the content, so we have some issues there we're working through in our panel. But what I wanted to point out a little bit was the ebook number bumped back up, and we saw that in every quarter last year that the ebook number was up. So that's a little bit contrary to what we're hearing elsewhere too. When we dive into that ebook data a little bit, it's a lot of self-published content that's being reported by our consumers. But ebook numbers are up across the board, and the other ones pretty consistent. I've got some U.S. data as well. So this is from Author Earnings, who just released, if you haven't gone to Author Earnings, he only did it once a year. He just released new data for the U.S. On market share of ebooks and things like that. So this is market share of online sales by format for all categories for the last 3 quarters of 2017. That's the data he had. It was the most up-to-date data I could find. So print is red, audio is kind of yellowish green, and blue is ebook. And what you can see there is that units sold by format, the ebook numbers are just huge, right? Across the whole market. Online, this is online sales. Unsurprisingly, when we look at the above pie charts, most online book purchases in 2017 were ebooks, while audiobooks made up a small but fast-growing share of units, 6%, and print books accounted for the remaining 39% of the units. In dollar terms, ebooks, with their generally lower purchase price, made up far smaller share of total online dollar spending, while 63% of online dollar spending was for print. I'm going to refer to Author Earnings one more time, but you should go check that site out when you have some time. So. We also asked our consumers and our readers what they read and what they purchased. So the top is physical book, the second is ebook, and the third is audiobook. The blue line is the number of people who told us that they read that format, and then the green line is the percentage of the people that told us they bought that format. So again, what I think is probably pretty interesting here is the ebook number and the audiobook number, that 52% of people told us they read an ebook, but only 22% bought ebooks. 28% listened to an audiobook, but only 4% bought. So that's an interesting thing. This is overall, if you look at the different categories, it breaks down differently all over the place, and I won't go too much into that. Where did they purchase those books? 52% of the books in our panel were purchased online in Canada last year. 46 were purchased in physical stores, and the others were found on the road. I'm not sure. So online was 46 in 2015 and 48% in 2016. So we've seen a steady increase in the online purchasing of physical books. What does this look like over time? Well, here's the trend line, and this is where it gets maybe a little more interesting from our panel anyway. So blue here is online, red is physical. Physical stores, and this is all content. But you can see that the online sales have been trending considerably up in Canada, and that line is pretty steep, while physical bookstores have been trending fairly down. That should come as a big surprise. Looking at this in format, we can break this down by format and subject. So the top grouping is ebooks, the bottom grouping is print, and I just picked out some subject categories. So comic graphic novels, which is the very top bar on both graphs. Obviously, there's not a lot of ebook purchasing of comic and graphic novels going on, at least from our consumer panel. But there is a lot in print, and that makes sense. But if you go down to the third bar from the bottom, which is kind of the light blue, that's romance. Romance is approaching 50% in our panel in digital and 50% in physical. And so you can look through the other graphs there. But when we look at nonfiction, it's kind of a similar breakdown. Nonfiction is a little less digital, except for things like business books and self-help tend to be a little more e-booky in our panel. Price. So one of the things we do is we ask in our some of our studies is what would a buyer in Canada pay for a book in a particular format and in a particular subject? So this is what they tell us they'll do. So I won't go into this in too much detail. The ebooks are around $8, and the print books, they say they'll pay around $12 or $13. What they're actually paying, according to our consumer panel, is a little bit less than that. So romance here is like $5.79. Illustrated nonfiction is $16.37. That's not a big thing in ebooks, so the sample size is small. And the ones that I've nulled out there with the little lines in them, that's just because we didn't have enough data for me to draw a conclusion. But basically what you can see here is that print books are more. The average fiction ebook goes for about $8 in our panel, and our average fiction physical book is $15.20. Average nonfiction ebook is $12.95. Average nonfiction physical book is $21.50. This is data from author earnings again, and this is prices last year from Amazon by price point. So you can see those low bands. That's a lot lower than our $8. I dropped off the 99-cent books when I was pulling the ebook data, so it kind of skews my data a little bit. And Nathan and Ryan, who are sitting here, have shared histograms just like this for Kobo in past years, so you can find those presentations online if you're curious about price. One of the things we're really curious about, so they're paying these prices, and they'll say usually they'll pay a little bit more. So do they find their books valuable? And what's interesting about books, and I've talked a little bit about this before, is that most of our consumers tell us that books are great value. 54% say they're great value for the price they pay. And a very small 7% say it's poor value. And then it ranges in between there. Ebooks, when we break it down by ebooks, they're much more polarizing. People either love them and they think they're great value, or they think they're really poor value. There's very little in the middle. It's really two ends of the scale. So that's pretty interesting. So slightly different direction than price, I'm going through these fast, is I want to talk about shopping. This picks up a little bit on the panel that we just had up here. So why do book buyers buy where they do? The number one reason is because of bad images. No, it's because of convenience, right? So the number one reason they tell us they shop in a place is that it's convenience. And what they mean is it's easy to shop at, or it's an easy way to buy books. So that doesn't mean a ton, but we can break that down a little bit. So convenience always is really far high on the top about why people shop in particular places. And so I've got two columns here. One is physical bookstores and one is online. So the number one reason why someone shops in a physical bookstore is because of selection. I think that's curation is what they're really getting at there. They like just browsing in the store. They love the immediacy of just walking to the shelf and getting a book. Price isn't that important when they're shopping in a physical store, but it's still important. And atmosphere comes in there. When we ask them about online shopping, or when we break it down by online shopping, the number one, besides convenience, the number one way is price, then selection, and then immediacy, and then free delivery. The other thing that impacts shopping is dogs. How loyal are you? So this is a new question we started asking last year about our book buyers, and this was touched on again by the book selling panel a little bit too. So 58% of all of our book buyers belong to a loyalty program. One of these loyalty programs primarily, but there are others. So, and the top one, the Reader Reward Card, I just picked McNally, but what that one is actually a lot of local and independent booksellers have loyalty programs. So they bought people in loyalty programs, bought 62% of all the books in our retail panel. So it's a really important awareness area. I'll talk briefly about awareness. This is awareness. We ask people where they've discovered the books they read. We ask this every year. I've shown it before. It's hard to compare it year over year because we keep adding new options to it. But I want to touch on social media. I want to touch on the stores, and I can do this pretty quickly. From our consumer panel, how did you become aware of the book that you actually bought? They saw it while browsing or searching or in a shop or online or elsewhere. From reading other books by authors in series, by a recommendation review, follow the author on social media, and saw it on bestseller list. And that's in order. I'm going to touch on browsing just quickly. The number one way people discover the books they read is in a physical store, when you just break them down. When you add up all the online areas, it's actually higher than a physical store. That number two area is by going onto an e-retailer site like Kobo or Amazon. And the third way is by organic search, typing in a search term into Google and then ending up at a store. After these, other websites, review websites, and social media rank. Reviews and recommendations. Getting a recommendation from a friend is the number one way they discover the books via that mechanism. Number two is going online and getting a recommendation from a retailer, like on the Amazon site or a Kobo site where they have retail reviews, and then general online, and then in newspapers and in media. going to skip over this one. I want to talk just briefly about social media. I don't like talking about social media too much, but so we did this study. It's actually out in the street right now. It's the state of digital. Some of you have already answered. If you haven't answered, we'd love to get you to answer state of digital. So in this survey, we're asking publishers about their digital capabilities and concerns. It just went out a couple weeks ago. So one of the top ways that publishers are telling us, or one of the top things that they're telling us that they're concerned or they feel will disrupt the publishing business even more is social media. Okay. The other ones that are tied with social media, there's a few there. There's augmented reality, there's new business roles, there's video and games and things like that. So this is on a small sample set. It's only about 50 responses. So when we ask our panelists where they saw a book ad in the last four weeks, the number 2 way is social media. The number 1 is email, which was discussed in the panel before. So when we also ask our panelists what social media platforms they use, this is book buyers, the number 1 is Facebook. I don't know about you, but my relationship with Facebook is kind of complicated right now. We're in a complicated relationship. I imagine, like many of you, I'm in the process of breaking up, but I'm not quite sure that I want to. We fulfill each other in weird ways, but you know, it's difficult. It's complicated. But the number 2 way is via YouTube, and then Twitter, then Instagram, then LinkedIn, Instagram, and Pinterest. Okay? I'm going to talk really fast because I'm almost out of time, or I'm out of time. I'm going to talk really fast about YouTube. YouTube is popping in all of our studies last year like it never had before. So it's becoming a discovery platform, it's becoming a consumption platform, it's popping everywhere. And we saw it come up all the time in our results. So it's being stressed as an influencer platform, right? And it works 2 ways here. So one is that this is where, actually this is a competition thing, this is where creators are going to sell their content. This is the new creative economy and what it generates for dollars for creators in the US. And you can just see how big YouTube is as a content creator driver of revenue. And where Amazon publishing, which is self-published or other published stuff by Amazon, comes in is quite a bit down the chart there. So they're your competitor, and they're just so damn big. And it's been discussed a little bit, but they can also help, right? And so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but these are book clubs. Book clubs on YouTube have become a massive thing. So Zoella, she has 12 million subscribers and more than 1 million views on her book club video, this one, and she does them quite regularly on YA titles. There's tons of these. I just picked 2. The other one is the Diversathon. It's a readathon for diversified books, and they have a YouTube channel as well. So it's a massive discovery platform, and it can be leveraged. I was going to talk a little more about Instagram. I'm not going to go into Instagram in a lot of detail. It's the number 1 influencer marketing platform now. They figure about 100% of influencers in the US are on Instagram. This is Giselle's new book. Giselle, Tom Brady's wife, Giselle Bündchen, the supermodel. She announced her new book yesterday on Instagram. Was the very first place she announced it. So it had tons and tons of likes and hits. So it's a huge influencer platform. So we've noticed over the years been a shift in where influencer marketing is executed. First it focused mainly on blogs, then it moved onto YouTube. We're still seeing that for books. Now it's all about Instagram, which seems to be a favorite among influencers. It's really a favorite among young book buyers. That shouldn't be a huge surprise. I've gone over time. And I was going to do a whole bunch of stuff about how to use YouTube, but Larissa from Harlequin did a session in room A earlier today that was spot on. And so just a shout out to Larissa's presentation, which we will make available. You can go and view that. She's got tons of stuff about how Harlequin uses YouTube to reach out to retailers and generate awareness. It's a really, really good presentation, so I highly recommend it. All our presentations will be available online. That was really fast. Thank you.